You'd think the guy who built a Formula One team from scratch with his own money would want to work closely with the person he hired to run it. But here's where it gets weird. A man and his partner in one of the most grueling sports in the world have openly admitted they now have absolutely nothing to do with each other. No contact, no conversations, nothing. They literally erased each other from their professional lives. This isn't a Hollywood drama between competing actors or rival CEOs fighting for market dominance. This is something far more telling about power, vision, and what happens when two people who seemed like an unstoppable team discover they're heading in completely different directions. The story of how a relationship deteriorated so completely that the guy running the entire operation had to walk away is actually a masterclass in how business partnerships can crumble under pressure. And trust me, the details of what actually broke them apart are far more nuanced and honest than you'd ever expect from someone in the high-stakes world of professional racing. This whole thing starts with what seemed like a perfect partnership. Gene Haas is an American, self-made industrialist who decided he wanted a seat at the Formula One table. He didn't just want to sponsor a team or be involved on the sidelines, he wanted ownership. He wanted to build something his way with his money under his vision. In 2016, Haas F1 entered the sport, and Gene brought in Guenther Steiner to lead the team as principal. If you know anything about Guenther, you know he's an Italian-American guy with an incredible track record in motorsports. He's direct, he's intense, and he knows how to navigate the politics of racing at the highest level. On paper, they seemed like the perfect combination. Gene had the money and the business mind, Guenther had the racing expertise and the experience in the paddock. Together, they could actually build something real, something competitive, right? But here's the thing about business partnerships that look perfect from the outside. They sometimes hide fault lines that nobody can see until the pressure gets too much. In the beginning, according to Guenther himself, they actually did agree on most things. They were aligned, they had a vision, they understood each other's goals and priorities. The early years of Haas F1 were actually pretty remarkable for a new team entering such a competitive and expensive sport. They were building infrastructure, hiring talent, improving year after year. But then 2020 happened, and everything changed. COVID wasn't just a global crisis that affected regular people, it fundamentally shook the entire Formula One ecosystem. Teams were struggling financially, the schedule was chaotic, and budgets that had been carefully planned suddenly became irrelevant. For Haas, this was particularly brutal. The team was already operating on a smaller budget than competitors like Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull. COVID hit different for them, and they struggled. They struggled hard to get back on their feet, and it was during this crisis that Guenther noticed something starting to shift between him and Gene. They started talking less, not because something catastrophic happened, but because the pressure and the stress of navigating a pandemic while running a Formula One team literally changed how they communicated. Think about that for a second. When things are good and aligned, you find reasons to talk to your partner. When things get difficult, suddenly there's less to say. There's less agreement. There's more frustration. And slowly, incrementally, the person who was your constant partner starts becoming just another person in the organization you have to work with. Guenther explains it as gradually watching a relationship deteriorate, but there was nothing overly bad about it. They disagreed sometimes, that's normal in any partnership, but they used to find ways out of those disagreements. They used to work through it. But after 2020, something fundamentally shifted. The talking became less frequent, the interactions became more transactional, and the distance between them just kept growing. What's fascinating about this kind of relationship breakdown is that it's not dramatic. There's no blowout argument, there's no public confrontation, there's just this slow, methodical dissolution where two people who once shared a clear vision start becoming strangers in the same workplace. And the thing is, Guenther's describing something that probably happens in hundreds of businesses every single year, but we rarely hear about it because it's not sexy or scandalous. It's just sad. It's just the reality of what happens when circumstances, pressure, and different priorities push people apart. Between 2020 and 2023, Haas F1 continued to struggle. They had some competitive moments, sure, but overall it was a period of inconsistency and frustration. From a driver perspective, they cycled through various lineups. From a technical perspective, they were constantly trying to play catch-up with bigger teams. And from an organizational perspective, the team was dealing with the consequences of not having that foundational alignment between the owner and the principal anymore. Guenther was making decisions based on what he thought was best for the team's long-term competitiveness. Gene, meanwhile, was dealing with the financial realities of running a team when your budget is a fraction of what Ferrari or Mercedes have. These aren't unreasonable positions. These are both legitimate concerns. But when you're not talking to each other regularly, when you're not in sync, small disagreements become big problems. Big problems become resentment, and resentment becomes the new baseline of your working relationship. During interviews and podcast appearances over the years, Guenther started hinting at frustration with the direction of the team. He'd talk about resource constraints, about the difficulty of being competitive with a limited budget, about the challenge of developing young drivers when you don't have the infrastructure of a top team. These weren't unfounded complaints, they were reality checks from someone who knew the sport intimately. But they also reflected a growing disconnection between what Guenther wanted for the team and what Gene was willing to provide, or able to provide. The real turning point came as the 2023 season approached. There were rumors floating through the paddock that Guenther's time at Haas might be coming to an end. Some people thought it was just speculation. Others in the know understood that this was actually a real possibility. By the end of 2023, those rumors became reality. Guenther's contract was not renewed. After 7 years of building this team, of navigating crises, of representing Haas in the media and the paddock, he was out. Haas made the decision to move in a different direction, and Guenther was replaced by Ayao Komatsu, who came from Ferrari's technical program. From a management perspective, it makes sense. Gene Haas wanted to try a different approach, a different leader, a different vision for the team. He had that right as the owner who was funding the entire operation. But here's where the real insight comes in, and this is what makes Guenther's recent candid discussions so important. He didn't just leave quietly and move on to another team or take a different role in motorsports. Instead, when asked directly about his relationship with Gene Haas during a recent interview on the High Performance podcast, Guenther gave an answer that was brutally honest in its simplicity. He said they have no relationship. Not a bad relationship, just no relationship at all. This isn't bitterness or anger. This is actually more poignant than that. It's resignation. It's acceptance. It's the acknowledgement that two people who once partnered to build something ambitious have now completely severed any connection they might have had. When Guenther talked about people he maintains good relationships with in the paddock, the list was actually quite extensive. He's respected. He's considered one of the knowledge keepers of Formula One. He understands the technical side, the political side, and the human side of the sport better than almost anyone working today. But with Gene, there's just nothing there anymore. Not hostility, not even cold professional distance, just complete separation. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. These two men could have run into each other at Formula One events, at paddock gatherings, at sponsor functions, but they don't interact. They don't acknowledge each other. They've essentially decided that their professional relationship is completely over, and there's no point in trying to salvage even basic civility. Guenther even added something that was quite telling. He said he's fine with it. He's moved on. He doesn't regret it. He's not sitting around wishing things had gone differently or hoping they might reconnect someday. He's just accepted that this partnership ended, and that's that. He went on to reference a classic business saying, "Whoever pays, decides." And he acknowledged that Gene had complete authority to take the team in whatever direction he wanted. Because fundamentally, Gene Haas built this team with his own money. He put his capital at risk. He had the ultimate say in every major decision. But here's what's really important about Guenther's position now, and this is something we don't hear enough of in sports. He's not bitter about it. He's not going around doing interviews just to throw criticism at Gene or justify his own decisions. Instead, he's being remarkably mature about the whole thing. He's acknowledged that Gene had every right to make the decision he made. He's acknowledged that ownership means authority, and that authority comes with the responsibility to make choices that you believe are best for your organization. This kind of perspective is rare in situations where someone has been relieved of a position they held for 7 years. Most people in Guenther's shoes would be defensive. They'd be creating narratives about how Gene didn't understand racing, or how the team failed because of management decisions from above, or how they were hamstrung by budget constraints. Guenther did none of that. Instead, he did something far more interesting. He shared his genuine perspective on how a professional relationship can deteriorate, despite starting with genuine alignment and mutual respect. He explained that he and Gene had disagreements all the time, but they used to work through them like adults. They'd find solutions, they'd find compromises, they'd find ways to move forward together. But eventually, the talking stopped, the problem solving became harder, and the connection just faded. And instead of pointing fingers or assigning blame, he's basically saying that sometimes relationships just don't work out, and you have to respect that and move forward. In the grand scheme of Formula One, Haas is a team that's always going to be in this interesting middle ground. They're not going to compete with Mercedes or Red Bull anytime soon, because they don't have the budget. But they can be competitive against other midfield teams if they're organized and strategic about their approach. Gene Haas knows this. He's been realistic about the team's position in the sport. But he also clearly believes that with the right leadership and the right approach, Haas can achieve more than what was being accomplished under Guenther. Whether that's going to work out remains to be seen. Ayao Komatsu is a competent leader with strong technical credentials, but replacing someone who built the organizational structure and culture of a team is never a simple process. There's going to be a transition period. There might be some rough patches. The team might actually struggle more before they get better, or they might find the new direction more effective than the old one. We're still in the early stages of that experiment. What we do know, based on Guenther's candid discussions, is that the previous partnership had run its course. The breakdown between Guenther and Gene is actually a really interesting case study in how even the best partnerships can deteriorate under pressure. They didn't have a fundamental personality clash. They didn't disagree about core values or the direction of the sport. They just found themselves pulled in different directions by circumstances beyond their control. And instead of pointing fingers or assigning blame, he's basically saying that sometimes relationships just don't work out, and you have to respect that and move forward. Stress, they withdrew from each other. And once the withdrawal started, it became self-perpetuating. Less communication led to less understanding. Less understanding led to more frustration. More frustration led to even less communication. It's a cycle that a lot of professional relationships go through, but it's rarely discussed this openly. Guenther's willingness to talk about it in such clear, non-accusatory terms is actually admirable. He's not playing victim. He's not blaming Gene for being difficult or unreasonable. He's just acknowledging that sometimes people grow apart. Sometimes partnerships end. And sometimes the best thing you can do is accept that and move on without regret or bitterness. Another really interesting aspect of the situation is what it says about ownership in Formula One. Gene Haas is wealthy, but he's not at the level of, say, Roman Abramovich or some of these ultra-billionaires who are buying sports teams as trophies. He's someone who took a significant portion of his wealth and invested it in a Formula One team because he genuinely wanted to be competitive in the sport. That's real risk. That's real commitment. But it also means that when things aren't going the way you hoped, when the investment isn't delivering the results you expected, you start to get frustrated. You start to wonder if you made the right choice in your leadership. You start to think about whether a change might help. And from that perspective, Gene's decision to move on from Guenther actually makes business sense. Sometimes in leadership roles, there's a shelf life. Sometimes bringing in fresh perspective can be beneficial even if the previous leader did solid work. What's notable about the Haas situation is that they've been a team defined by underperformance relative to their investment and the talent involved. They've had strong drivers at various points: Sergio Perez, Romain Grosjean, Nikita Mazepin briefly, and others. They've spent money on their facilities and infrastructure, but they haven't been able to translate all that investment into consistent results. Year after year, they'd show competitive pace in certain races, then struggle in others. There's an inconsistency that suggests something deeper is going on in the organization. Whether that's a technical issue, a strategy issue, a leadership issue, or some combination of all three remains unclear. But from the outside looking in, it seems like the disconnection between Gene and Guenther might have been contributing to that inconsistency. When your owner and your principal aren't on the same page, that trickles down through the entire organization. People sense it, people get confused about priorities, people stop trusting the long-term vision of the company. The fact that Guenther stayed for 7 years despite this growing divide is actually a testament to his professionalism and his commitment to the job. A lot of people in his position would have quit much earlier if they felt like their relationship with the owner had deteriorated to the point where there was essentially no relationship. But Guenther stayed. He kept showing up to work. He kept trying to make the best decisions for the team. He kept representing Haas professionally in meetings and media appearances. Even when he knew the partnership was essentially over, he didn't check out mentally or emotionally. He continued to do his job as well as he could under difficult circumstances. That actually speaks volumes about his character and his professionalism, even if the ultimate result was that he and Gene decided to part ways. Now, from Gene Haas's perspective, you have to give him credit for being willing to shake things up. It would have been easier to just leave Guenther in place, to maintain continuity, to avoid the disruption of a leadership change. But Gene made a decision that the team needed new direction, and he was willing to take that risk. Whether it pays off is going to depend on a lot of factors: the technical direction of Formula One, budget allocation, driver development, strategic decision-making, all of that. But at least he was willing to make a change rather than keep trying the same approach that wasn't working. The relationship between an owner and the leader they hire to run the day-to-day operations is arguably the most important relationship in any sports organization. When that's not working, nothing else matters. You can have great facilities, you can have talented drivers, you can have smart engineers. But if the guy running the whole operation is not aligned with the person funding it, you're going to have problems. The Haas situation is a really clear example of this principle in action. For 7 years, Guenther was there trying to build something, trying to improve the team, trying to make the best of limited resources. Gene was there as the owner, making financial decisions, setting priorities, thinking about the long-term viability of his investment. And somewhere in that dynamic, they lost the ability to communicate effectively about the things that matter most. They stopped having those crucial conversations where you figure out how to move forward together. And instead of fighting through it or working to repair the relationship, they just let it fade until eventually Gene decided it was time to move in a different direction. What's kind of refreshing about this whole situation, honestly, is that both guys are handling it with maturity. There's no public feuding, there's no name-calling, there's no accusations of incompetence or mismanagement. There's just an acknowledgement that the partnership didn't work out, and they're both moving forward. Guenther has gone on to other opportunities in motorsports. He's become a sought-after analyst and commentator because people value his insight and experience. Gene is continuing to invest in Haas, clearly believing that a new direction will yield better results. And the team continues to operate, competing in Formula One, trying to find its place in the sport. Whether the change of leadership at Haas turns out to be successful or not, we won't really know another year or two. These things take time to evaluate properly. But what we do know is that Guenther's willingness to talk candidly about what went wrong between him and Gene gives us insight into how professional relationships actually work, how they deteriorate, and how people who once worked closely together can ultimately end up with no connection at all. It's not a story of betrayal or incompetence, it's a story of people growing apart under pressure, of communication breaking down, and of both parties ultimately respecting each other enough to make a clean break rather than continuing to bang their heads against a wall trying to make something work that just wasn't working anymore. One of the things that struck me most about Guenther's recent interviews is how he's been able to compartmentalize his feelings about the situation. He's not sitting around claiming that he and Gene ended on perfect terms. He's not pretending that the breakdown didn't happen or wasn't significant. But he's also not dwelling on it or trying to convince everyone that he was wronged. Instead, he's looking at it as what it is, a professional situation that didn't work out the way either of them hoped.
He's acknowledged that Gene had the authority to make the decision he made. He's acknowledged that in a business relationship, the person who's funding the operation has the right to call the shots. But he's also been clear that from his perspective, things could have been handled better, and that the lack of communication between them was a real problem. This is actually a really mature way to handle a professional breakup, and it's something we could all learn from. In a world where social media makes it so easy to air grievances publicly and build a narrative where you're the hero and the other person is the villain, Guenther's approach is refreshing. He's not claiming moral high ground, he's not trying to convince people that Gene is a bad guy or that he was mistreated, he's just being honest about what happened and accepting that sometimes professional relationships don't work out. The Formula One paddock is a relatively small community. Drivers, engineers, mechanics, team principals, and owners all see each other regularly at racetracks around the world. It's a global sport, but the people involved in it operate in a fairly tight circle. That means that your reputation matters enormously. How you conduct yourself when things go wrong, how you speak about your former colleagues and partners, that's all noticed and remembered by the community. Guenther, by handling the situation with maturity and respect for Gene, has essentially protected his own reputation and standing in the sport. Meanwhile, Gene, by being willing to acknowledge that a change was necessary rather than doubling down on a failing approach, has shown that he's capable of making tough decisions for the benefit of his organization. So, in some weird way, even though their personal relationship has deteriorated to the point of complete separation, they've both handled the professional end of the situation in ways that actually enhance their credibility and their standing in the sport. That's not always how these things go. Sometimes, when professional relationships end, both parties end up looking bad. There's conflict, there's blame, there's public drama. But in this case, because both guys have handled it with maturity and honesty, they've both come out of it okay. Guenther's career hasn't been damaged by being let go from Haas. If anything, his stock has actually gone up because of how he's discussed the situation. And Gene has signaled to the rest of the paddock that he's willing to make the hard call when he thinks the team needs a change. Looking forward, the real question for Haas is whether this change of leadership is going to result in improved performance. The technical regulations of Formula One are fairly consistent from year to year, but there's always room for interpretation and innovation. A new principle with different priorities and a different approach might lead to breakthroughs that Guenther's leadership wasn't achieving. Or it might create disruption and cause the team to take a step backward before eventually moving forward. These things are unpredictable. But what we can say with certainty is that the partnership between Gene Haas and Guenther Steiner came to an end not with a bang, but with a whimper. It gradually deteriorated, communication broke down, and eventually both parties realized that the best thing they could do for each other and for the team was to move in different directions. The broader lesson here, I think, is about the importance of communication in any partnership, especially in high-stress environments like Formula One. When you're working under pressure, when there are external factors creating stress and uncertainty, the relationship between you and your partner becomes even more important. You need to be in constant communication. You need to be solving problems together. You need to be united in your vision and your priorities. The moment you stop communicating, the moment you start withdrawing from each other, that's when the partnership starts to die. Guenther and Gene stopped communicating during the COVID crisis when the team was struggling, and instead of recognizing that as a warning sign and working to repair the relationship, they just let it get worse and worse until eventually there was nothing left to repair. This is true in Formula One, but it's also true in business generally. The relationship between ownership and leadership is the foundation of any organization. When that's not working, everything else falls apart. Guenther's willingness to talk about this publicly and honestly is actually valuable for anyone involved in business or leadership, because most of us will experience the deterioration of a professional relationship at some point in our careers. Most of us will have to navigate situations where someone we once worked well with becomes someone we can no longer work with. And the way to handle that, with maturity, respect, honesty, and a willingness to let go without bitterness, is something that Guenther Steiner has actually modeled quite well. So, while the breakdown of the relationship between Gene Haas and Guenther Steiner might seem like just another story from the Formula One paddock, it's actually a pretty compelling reminder about how important communication is, how quickly partnerships can deteriorate when you stop talking to each other, and how important it is to handle the end of a professional relationship with grace and maturity. And that's really the heart of this whole situation.